Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Hello and welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder. I'm your host, Tyler, and I come hat in hand because I haven't released an episode in a while. As many of you know, I'm a teacher by day, and so the end of the year gets kind of nuts, and I'm a writer. Writer is my other sort of evening profession. And I've been working on the new book, and I'm in the third draft, and I'm just furiously trying to finish that. And so the podcast kind of, I sent it over into the corner with the iPad while I worked on something else. So it could watch YouTube videos while I worked on the other things. But let's forget about that. I'm back, and I have a positively horrifying and dare I say, unsolved case for you. Now, this one's a little off the beaten path. It's a murder, and it involves Nashville, but it doesn't happen in Nashville. So it's literally off the beaten path, I guess. It's one of those things. Okay, let's just get into it. You'll understand just in a second why it still counts as a Nashville case once we get into it. And let's just do that. Let's get right into things. You'll understand. Let's get there. My sources for this episode include a real, actual episode of Unsolved Mysteries hosted by Robert Stack from back in the 90s. I think 1994. It's season 6, episode 20. If you want to go find it, it's up on YouTube, and the reenactments for this episode are just perfect. I also followed a few Reddit threads and read a couple of articles. I used our Unresolved Mysteries, and there's a thread by the user ElementaryFan on Reddit. So all credit goes to the people who did the original research, or at least, presented it in a way that I could find it. So, moving into September 1992, it was the era of grunge and CD Walkman and the drink Clearly Canadian. I don't know if you remember that, but in Nashville, a local music video company ran 2 ads in the classifieds trying to sell the central processing unit and monitor for an Apple Quadra 950. Now, if you don't know what that is, neither do I, but it was an Apple mega computer machine. And, this was 1992, so it wasn't like today where you can get a Chromebook for $100. Computers were still kind of like Star Trek, just kind of like a new path for man. And the company that ran the ads put 22-year-old Jeremy Rolfs, a senior at Tennessee State University, TSU, in charge of the process. One of the ads read, and this is the text for the ad, "Ultimate Power." Ultimate's in all caps. Apple Quadra 950 plus some other details. And the price on this, I'll give you a second to guess what you think it would cost. You think of a computer, you think, what, $1,000, $2,000? $24,000 OBO, or best offer. That's nuts for a computer. Just thinking about that is crazy. But it also reveals, like, this may be the first mistake. I know we're not supposed to blame victims, but it's really the company's fault, not Jeremy Rolfe's fault. Putting the price for such a huge and costly piece of computer equipment, criminals are drawn to that sort of thing, especially in the classifieds ads. So the ad runs, and on October 7th, 1992, a man calling himself Tom Johnson, and that's how I'm going to refer to him, is as Tom Johnson, called about the ad and said he was a freelance computer programmer. Jeremy even met up with this guy. He met up with Tom Johnson to preview how the equipment worked. Unfortunately, there were no other witnesses to this event, and so it kind of went completely unnoticed, except by Jeremy himself. The guy was from Georgia. And so since the destination for this whole thing was 200 miles away, Jeremy decided to drive through the night. He had been working for over 30 hours on another project, so over a day. And his fiancée, Heather Uffelman, joined him to keep him awake. They left at 1:30 a.m. on October 24th and set off for Marietta, Georgia. If you're not familiar with the area, Marietta is around Atlanta, and I went to the University of Georgia, so this one is also, kind of related to me in a distant way. And many of the college freshmen I encountered my first year, I'd never really heard of Marietta. I was from a super small town in Georgia, a lot of people from Marietta. So I don't know what it was like in 1992, but it's a kind of affluent area. So not, a place to be afraid of going. Heather and Jeremy arrived at the motel where they were meeting Tom Johnson at 7:30 a.m. Originally, they had been set up to meet at an industrial park, but Tom Johnson said the directions were so complicated that it'd be better to meet somewhere else. And since Jeremy had spent plenty of time wandering through industrial parks looking for unmarked addresses, he thought this was a reasonable request. The motel was easy to find. It was in a public place, yada, yada, yada. When they arrive, Tom said that his business partner had the check and would be along in an hour or so. So the couple went to breakfast. When they came back a little bit later, Tom said he'd spoken with the business partner and was on his way. Rolfes so trusted the guy that none of this struck him as odd, and so he just went along with it. And there's an element of trust here that I think shows that this Tom guy seemed like a normal dude. There were no clues that he was anything but who he said he was. At 8 a.m., he suggested that they load the computer into the car, so they did, and then they made small talk for another 20 minutes or so before Jeremy asked Tom where the president of the company was. So he actually said, we need the check so we can close this deal. It was at that time that Tom Johnson pulled a gun on them and said, "I think we can close this deal right now." This is where things get dark. So if you're averse to violence, maybe check in next time. Tom had Jeremy and Heather lie down on the ground before rolling them up in blankets. Like they had to roll themselves up instead of like tying them up, I guess. And so that's what happened. And he had Jeremy turn away from Heather. And all of a sudden, Jeremy heard a loud buzzing sound in his ear. And the room began to spin because Tom had just struck Jeremy in the back of the head with a claw hammer. He then went over to Heather and hit her with the hammer. And Heather let out these horrible, blood-curdling screams, as I imagine most people would if they were being hit with a hammer. When Jeremy said, "Stop screaming and he'll leave," Tom hit Jeremy over the head several more times before returning to Heather. Jeremy remained conscious through the whole ordeal and was able to see Tom dust the counter for fingerprints before leaving. And as soon as Tom was gone, Jeremy freed himself and crawled over to Heather to tell her he would get help for them and that they would be all right. What he saw would haunt him until his dying day. He would later say, and I think it's okay now to reveal that he survived, that he said that all hours of the day, all he could picture was the sight of Heather's face in that moment. He called 911 and they were rushed to the hospital where Heather succumbed to her injuries at around 12:30 p.m. that day. Jeremy, it should be noted, was released from the hospital on October 27th and survived. Meanwhile, investigators questioned witnesses and scanned the motel room for evidence. There were no security cameras, so that was a total non-starter. Among the only clues left behind was the murder weapon itself. It was brand new, the hammer was, still wrapped in plastic, and it still had the card with the SKU number attached, the kind of hammer it was. And even though they had that information, detectives and investigators were not able to narrow down exactly where the hammer was purchased. Detectives then looked into all local men named Tom Johnson with a criminal record, and when that did not match, they looked into the backgrounds of everyone working at the motel. And here's a strange detail that I think is important but doesn't really go anywhere. An hour before the attacks, an unknown woman went to the front desk and complained about the room rented out to Tom Johnson. This was while Jeremy and Heather had gone out for breakfast, so investigators believe it might have been his accomplice. She said that there was a loud commotion happening in the room, this person, and the motel didn't really follow up on it. And had they might have saved Heather Uffelman's life. And it's just a very strange detail that we don't know who this woman was and what her motives were and what the outcome would have been. Investigators also discovered that Tom was driving a black Cherry Dodge Dynasty with a red interior and Tennessee license plates. That's kind of where the story itself ends. There is no grand investigation. There is no gathering of suspects. There is no arrest. There's no trial. The case kind of fizzles. And here's why. The main suspect in the attack on Heather Uffelman and Jeremy Rolfs is a computer store owner named Tom Steeples. There's some circumstantial evidence below that may make you think he is the suspect and is connected to the Uffelman-Rolfs case. But first, let's kind of do a deeper dive on Steeples himself. Tom Steeples, by any definition of the word, was a monster. He murdered his business partner, Ronald Bingham, a Nashville bar owner, in October of 1993, over a year after the events in this episode. He beat and sexually assaulted a young woman in the 1980s, an unconnected but still horrific crime. And the first link to this case is the composite photo, which looks a heck of a lot like Tom Steeples. And here's another detail I found on Reddit. Before Steeples died, Jeremy Rolfs requested to see his photograph, but the Marietta Police Department would not provide one, claiming they could only show Jeremy a photo lineup if it contained a picture of someone who was a suspect in the case, and they did not consider Steeples to be a suspect at the time. So because he wasn't a suspect, even though Jeremy wanted to see the photograph. They wouldn't do it. I mean, the red tape makes sense, but it might have solved this case if they had just allowed him to see the photograph. Furthermore, the car Tom Johnson was driving had Tennessee plates, and Tom Steeples was from Tennessee, which millions of people are, but it's another link. Steeples had committed a double. This is another link. Steeples committed a double murder in a motel room in April of 1994, around 2 years later, that was similar to the attack on Rolfs and Uffelman. He lured a couple, Rob and Kelly Phillips, to a motel with the promise of a record deal and then beat them to death. I'll probably end up doing this case at some point, so I'm going to leave the details a little opaque here. After all of this was over, Jeremy Rolfs contacted Unsolved Mysteries about possibly doing an episode on the case, but it was unnecessary because they had already flagged the case for research. Now, why was there no follow-up? Why was Tom Steeples not investigated more closely? Why was he not brought on trial or arrested? Why did none of that happen in the case sort of go to the wind? Well, there's actually a good reason. And that reason that we'll probably never know the truth in this case is that Tom Steeples died of a drug overdose while in prison in July of 1994 without ever officially being named as the main suspect. I want to offer two more bits of information, one sad and one happy, that are postscripts of this case. One, I'll start with the bad news. We'll get the bad news out of the way first. So shortly after the Unsolved Mysteries episode aired in 1994, Jeremy Ross joined the Peace Corps, which is good news. I'm all for people joining the Peace Corps. But he was later killed in a car accident in March 1997 in South Africa after he was hit head-on by another car where the driver had fallen asleep at the wheel. So Jeremy Ross' life ended and he kind of lived his life in tragedy. And I imagine one of the reasons he probably joined the Peace Corps was a way of dealing with the trauma he had suffered at the hands of maybe Tom Steeples. And it would later lead to his death. The positive aspect of this case is that Jeremy and Heather's families later created the Heather Uffelman Memorial Scholarship in her honor. And so, at least in death, she gets her name to go on. And I know her family, for a fact, would rather have her here. But sometimes we don't always get that choice. And I normally add my 2 cents in at the end of these cases, but I think it's pretty obvious at this point that, to me, it seems pretty obvious that Tom Steeples was the killer in this case. We don't have any concrete evidence, but the circumstantial evidence seems pretty there. I mean, if I were a killer, I wouldn't name myself something related to my name. But I guess the thinking is that if you name yourself Tom Johnson, you will answer to Tom, so you won't have to think like, oh, I'm now Ricky. So, I mean, that maybe even tightens the case on it being Tom Steeples. And he was clearly a monster who was capable of murder because he committed murder before in a very similar way. So it's a sad case. It's a case without an ending. And I always find it kind of difficult to do these because, you know, I like to offer closure. Stephen King once talked about writing really dark novels and said that there has to be a ray of sunshine at the end to sort of show the people that there is hope. And, you know, he was talking, I think, about The Stand when he wrote about, you know, it has to kind of have this good conquering evil element. And his short stories are not the same way, but his novels generally that have these really, you know, difficult situations and death of main, you know, these characters you've seen for hundreds of pages. And real life is not fiction, but I like to end on a more positive note. But this one just doesn't have that. It ends in sadness and despair. And sometimes that happens too. Okay. That is this very brief episode of Music City Murder. I want to remind you that we do have a Patreon if you want to go over. It's $1 per month. So less than the cost of, bottled water at the store. You can get access to the archive of episodes that's over there. I'm currently in the middle of doing the Richard Ramirez series, which is very dark. And I plan on concluding that in the next few weeks. So there's that. And it's just, a good time if you like true crime. So this is Tyler signing off. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time on Music City